Do people want to introduce themselves? And we can start with that. We can start with people talking about themselves, and maybe why you wanted to attend today. So maybe let's talk about that. We have Kelly already. Okay, Lydia, you can start, then Kelly.
Well, my name's Lydia Schilt. I'm part of the training department. I'm fairly new here, so to OPD, and my background is in social services. So this is really something different for me, working at OPD. But so far, so good. I like it here, so yeah. And well, I'm helping out Moses today.
Hey, I'm Kelly Driscoll. I'm an attorney in Missoula. Moses and I are on a panel or a board together, so I've gotten to know him through that and know him to be a very smart person and wanted to learn more from him today. So that's why I'm here today. I do have to leave at 3 to get my kid. So I'm hoping that we can get Moses going.
I will introduce myself. Oh, getting feedback. Never mind. Is that better now?
Yes.
Well, anyway, I'm Nick Hyde. It's not working. I'm going to do this in the chat.
Okay, we got your chat.
While Nicholas is doing that, I will introduce myself. I'm Shannon Hathaway. I'm actually Kelly's law partner. So I'm a contract OPD attorney here in Missoula. And looking forward to the topics today that Moses is going to talk about.
And there's Lindsay. If you don't mind, you could introduce yourself. I think Lindsay's talking, but we can't hear.
Can you hear me?
No, now we can hear.
Okay. My video and my microphone are both on, but I don't know. My name is Teal. I go by my middle name Teal. I've been contracting with the Public Defender's Office for a number of years now. Moses, I'm interested in the topic. I read your appeals and I'm just wanting to learn more.
Thank you, Lindsay. And so for those of you who just joined, we are waiting for the main session to let out so we can get started. It's unfortunate, but that's where we are. So while we are waiting, you can introduce yourself and then you can tell us a little bit why you're interested in today's topic. I see Diane Rice, I see Jeremy Morrow, David Carter. Diane is trying to talk, I think. Lydia,
Okay.
How is it?
People are coming in.
All people are starting to come in, so I'll give them 3-4 minutes, and then so let's say 1:15, and we'll get started, or before if they are all seated.
Okay.
Have they not actually wrapped up in the other room yet? Or?
They did, but they didn't talk about the other rooms and that.
Oh,
Oh, okay.
They just started the next.
So are we waiting for some people to come from that room?
Yeah, they're still trickling in. I think you should go ahead and start. I think it's safe to say, yeah.
Okay. I'll get started. My name is Moses Okeyo. I'm a humble African, and as an adult, I also became an American. So I see myself as a storyteller. I think my calling is to tell stories with complexity, completeness, and dimension. And this year, the best thing that happened to me on 2021, the end of 2021, was the birth of my daughter, Makeba. And I would be remiss if I did not prepare Makeba for this meritocracy that you assure me exists in America. And so for the sake of my daughter, it's why I agreed to do this. I believe, I'm an optimist. I believe better must come. I believe COVID is the final wake-up call to the world because we need cross-racial human solidarity. We need to tap into our communities. We need to tap into our collective conscience. And so, which is why I'm doing this presentation. So before we go too much further, I'll say, I have a disclaimer to make. The views that I'm going to express are my own views, and they do not reflect the views of the OPD. I guess we'll begin with the preamble to the Declaration of Independence. It says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed with their Creator certain unalienable rights, that among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." So a young nation said these impressive things, these lofty ideals, and then promptly was seduced by the English and the European aristocracies, and they started to struggle to define men. Does men include Native Americans? Does men include Black? Does men include women? And so on my first day of law school, my professor, Kevin Brown, a Black professor, posed this question: what is the law and who is it for? And so I think part of the task today is to convince fish that we are surrounded by water. Ralph Waldo Emerson called the law a memorandum. So at any point in history, the law captured the prevailing sentiment of the times. The Anglo-Saxon legal system evolved from the English common law, and the foundation was to protect the haves from the have-nots. Frederick Douglass said, "Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, it never will." So Black and brown people have had to demand for the right to be treated as men, as reflected in the United States Constitution. So to Black and brown people, the story of America is a power struggle. It's a struggle with the dominant culture who always keeps coming up with the new ways of systematically devaluing and dehumanizing Black and brown people. So Black and brown people have, since the inception of the nation, had to fight to be recognized as men. Okay, so if the law captures, it's a memorandum of the times, the Dred Scott decision, 1857, was a memorandum of its time. The court said, "The opinion of the court, the legislation and histories of the times, and the language used in the Declaration of Independence show that neither the class of persons who have been imported as slaves, nor their descendants, whether they have become free or not, were then acknowledged as part of the people, nor intended to be included in the general words used in that memorable instrument. They had for more than a century before been regarded as being beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit. He was bought and sold and treated as ordinary article of merchandise and traffic whenever profit could be made by it. And the opinion continued. This opinion was at the time fixed and universal in the civilized portion of the white race. It was regarded as an axiom in morals as well as in politics, which no one thought of disputing or supposed to be open to dispute. And men in every grade and position in society daily and habitually acted upon it in their private pursuits, as well as in matters of public concern, without doubting for a moment the correctness of this opinion. So that was the memorandum of the time in Plessy v. Ferguson, law, the memorandum of his time. Justice Brown described the dominant white culture's power as follows: the power to assign to a particular coach, which obviously implies the power to determine to which race the passenger belongs, as well as the power to determine who, under the laws of the particular state, is to be deemed white and who a colored person. So in the opinion, it says, it is claimed by the plaintiff in error that in any mixed community, the reputation of belonging to the dominant race, in this instance, the white race, is property in the same sense that a right of action or of inheritance is property. Conceding this to be so, for the purpose of this case, we are unable to see how this statute deprives him of or in any way affects his right to such property. If he be a white man and assigned to a colored coach, he may have his action for damages against the company for being deprived his so-called property. Upon the other hand, if he be a colored man and be assigned, he has been deprived of no property since he is not lawfully entitled to the reputation of being a white man. So is whiteness still property in this country? Is it currency? And then there was the famous dissent by Justice Harlan in Plessy. And the dissent said, the white race deems itself to be the dominant race in this country. And so it is in prestige, in achievement, in education, in wealth, and in power. So I doubt not it will continue to be for all times. It remains true to its great heritage and holds fast to the principle of constitutional liberty. But in the view of the Constitution, in the eye of the law, there is in this country no superior, dominant ruling class of citizen. There is no caste here. Our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. In respect of civil rights, all citizens are equal before the law. So, and that has been the power struggle the brown and black people found themselves in the US. So again, the question becomes, is there a white caste system in America? Now, in the second part of our presentation, we'll talk about state v. peoples, which the Montana Supreme Court just decided a few weeks ago. Is peoples the memorandum of our time? Does it capture the prevailing sentiment in Montana? So I think that in Montana, we don't want to talk about race. We don't want to talk about systemic oppression. Whenever we argue in our papers about race, the Supreme Court acts as if we haven't made those arguments, glosses over it, or ignores them. And so public defenders, you public defenders, seem also well adjusted to accept this systemic racial injustice. We also maybe don't want to risk upsetting the court. So are we gatekeepers? Are we apologists? Are we justifiers? Okay, so before we start, I'll show this video.
The Blind Man and the Elephant by John G. Sachs. It was 6 men of Hindustan, to learning much inclined, who went to see the elephant, though all of them were blind, that each by observation might satisfy his mind. The first approached the elephant, and happening to fall against his broad and sturdy side, at once began to bawl, "God bless me, but the elephant is very like a wall." The second, feeling of the tusk, cried, "Ho, what have we here? So very round and smooth and sharp, to me 'tis very clear, this wonder of an elephant is very like a spear." The third approached the animal, and happening to take the squirming trunk within his hands, thus boldly up he spake, "I see," quoth he, "the elephant is very like a snake." The fourth reached out his eager hand, and felt about the knee. "What most this wondrous beast is like is very plain," quoth he, "'tis clear enough, the elephant is very like a tree." The fifth, who chanced to touch the ear, said, "E'en the blindest man can tell what this resembles most. Deny the fact who can? This marvel of an elephant is very like a fan." The sixth no sooner had begun about the beast to grope, than seizing on the swinging tail that fell within his scope, "I see," quoth he, "the elephant is very like a rope." And so these men of Hindustan disputed loud and long, each in his own opinion, exceeding stiff and strong, though each was partly in the right, and all were in the wrong. Moral. So oft in theologic wars, the disputants, I ween, rail on in utter ignorance of what each other mean, and prate about an elephant not one of them has seen.
I think these discussions about racism are ripe for misunderstanding, and we all prate about something we don't really have much grasp on. And so the bizarre thing about this video, it's attributed to John G. Sachs, not to the Indians from Hindustan from which he stole it from. That's also part of the point. But okay, imagine you are one of these blind people, and you have the misfortune of standing behind the elephant as she took a ritual dump. It will be of little comfort to you if somebody else insists the elephant is like a rope, or the elephant is like a tree, or the elephant is like a fan. The point is, often we assume, like, especially this goes to white persons, some of them assume that their experience with the legal, carceral, economic, educational system, the way the system treats them is the same way that the system treats the Black person, the Native American, the Hispanic, the trans, which is often not the case. The fact that you can be mouthy and argue when interacting with the police doesn't mean I can do the same. So imagine if we stopped discounting the experiences of the Native American, the Black person, the poor white person, and imagine if we used our collective conscience and our collective perception create a more realistic, a truer picture of what the elephant in the room is. Imagine if we practiced cross-racial and human solidarity. The white people listening to black people listening to white people sharing how they've been harmed by this racial oppression, which white people are also, poor white people and white people of all classes are also harmed by racism. Native Americans listening to Latinos, so we can construct a shared reality so that through cross-racial human solidarity, we can share notes, share the perception of the elephant in the room. Racism is, as I said earlier, is a power struggle. The dominant race holding wrongly to the belief that it's superior to the subjugated race, and then continue exerting power to control the lives and order the lives of the other races through the media, through schools, through banks, through the police, through media, through theater. So Desmond Tutu said, if an elephant has its foot on the tail of a mouse and you say that you're neutral, the mouse will not appreciate your neutrality. You have pretty much chosen the side of the status quo. So I have to say, I have to name my fears. I'm afraid that I'm being misunderstood right now. I'm afraid I might do more harm than good. I'm afraid I might get fired. I might lose my job over this. I'm afraid that some of you may be seeing me as un-American and a malcontent. I'm afraid some of you are thinking I'm doing this for some promotion or some other gain. I'm afraid some of you may be selectively hearing what I'm saying. I'm afraid the OPD might never be an inclusive place. More above all, I'm afraid that we might be harming our clients of color. Are we the gatekeepers? Do we accept racial injustice and offer them justifications for it? But also, really, you should stop telling your clients you know the prosecutors and you know them to be good guys. So I'll tell you a bit about my interactions with the elephant, for what it's worth. The entire legal system in Montana seems to be in denial. The denial is not a river in Egypt. We are in denial that there's anything systemic, there's systemic oppression of the Native Americans. We're in denial that there's the systemic oppression of Black people. In our view, there is no systemic oppression. There is no racial component, no racial dimension in Montana. You've seen in Missoula, if you're in Missoula and other places, all these people the entire legal system is waiting for good data. Today in the OPD, we talked about good data. You know, everybody's waiting, having this buzzword. The whole system is buzzing, data-driven decision-making. In my view, data-driven decision-making will not overcome implicit bias. In my mind, all these jurists, all these people at the top of this legal system do not really believe that systemic oppression really exists. They do not really believe there is any disparate or unequal outcomes for the different races. They are waiting for data, this thing to come to prove it. So what is your theory of injustice? I like stories. I like to tell stories. So this is my attempt at using anecdotes to get around into this issue. So these three kids, what value do they have? The one on the left side is me. The one in the middle is my daughter, Makeba. And the one on the right is my partner, my wife, Martina. And I'll tell you about the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was enacted in 1882. And the white miners who had all the power through their institutions imposed oppressive taxes and restrictions on the Chinese. The people, the rich people with corporations wanted cheap labor, so then they imported a whole bunch of Chinese people to work on the railway, and then the white miners felt that they were being replaced, and so they rallied together through their institutions and enacted the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was mostly to protect white laborers, their way of life. And in 1885 in Tacoma, the mayor, the school board of education, legal professionals, local press, and other influential people were holding mass meetings, and where they riled up a crowd, and then they went and rounded up all the Chinese in the town and marched them out of town. And then they proceeded to loot and burn Chinese property. And then this was lawful the longest time. It was, I think it was repealed in 1943. And then finally in 1965, the United States Congress did away with the restriction on immigration was only restricted to white persons of good moral character. So this was the case from 1790 all the way to 1965. So recently there was an article in the New Yorker about this constable in a California town that kept ledger of all the Chinese, their size of their fingers, whatever deformities they had on their bodies. So under the color of law, the police were oppressing Chinese people. I mentioned this to say that after the 1965 immigration allowed Asians and Africans to start immigrating, which were incidentally the 1965 immigration was as a result of the civil rights movement, pointing out how discriminatory it was to restrict immigration to white persons of good moral character. In 1967, this picture is my father-in-law, and she met my mother-in-law in about 1967, and the kid in the lap here is my wife, another generation later. Now, the absurdity of race. Now, whenever we have to check race for my daughter, we check Black, Asian, and Caucasian to show you how absurd race is. So the objectives today is to have a shared definition of racism. We'll cover these three definitions, and then we'll in the second hour, we'll explore some constructions of racism. And then in the second hour, we'll also apply the systemic oppression lens to the case the Montana Supreme Court decided. And so the objective today is to have a shared understanding or definition of racism, and then start to discuss some of these cases using those lenses, using the shared meaning. So we all know what we're talking about, and we're not arguing about different things. So we'll start with Montana. So I'm not one to talk really about numbers, but Black people, Latinos, Native Americans are overrepresented in our Montana jails. The Native Americans are 6% of the population, and the African Americans are less than 1% of the population, but then the proportion in jail is quite high. So there is unequal incarceration rates and unequal arrest. In Montana, the Native Americans, like I said, 6% of the state residents, but they constitute 25% of the people in jail and 22% of the people in prison. Why is that? Nationally, mass incarceration is a $80 billion per year industry, 6.6 million people who are who are being controlled in the correctional system. 1 in 4 Black Americans will be incarcerated during their lifetime. Of the 2.3 million people in prisons, 40% are Black. Of course, the 13th Amendment outlawed slavery, and then there was a little clause, except as punishment for crimes. So the retired slave men saw the opportunity. They morphed. Instead of plantation slavery, they changed into the prison industry system. So this is what we are talking about. I'll tell you a little bit about myself, my interactions with this system. I had to fight not to be the 1 in 4 statistic. Before law school, in 2007, in Pocatello, Idaho, I was arrested on suspicion of a DUI. The officer had no probable cause to stop my vehicle, and then they proceeded to give me a breathalyzer, which malfunctioned. The only lawyer I knew at the time was a divorce lawyer, and he encouraged me to plead guilty, and then he negotiated no jail time and a small fine. So the deal seemed good. I pled guilty. Later, when I realized all the problems with the case, I fought on my own to get it expunged, which I successfully did. 2010, before law school, I lived in Helena. One Friday night, I walked into one of those watering holes to have a drink. A few minutes later, 6 officers walked in. They spied a Black man near the front of the bar. Come with us. A white guy just got beat up by a Black man. So naturally, I was the culprit. The 6'5" officer was aggressive and ready, hands next to his gun, shining a big flashlight in my face, ready for me to resist arrest. Had I mouthed off or taken exception with a stop, maybe I would have gotten a decent beating. Luckily, dispatch told the officer to cut me loose. In another incident, after I was a lawyer, 2018, there was a traffic stop outside East Missoula. The officer quickly went to the passenger side and had his hand on his service weapon the whole time. So assume that the white victim picked me from a lineup. Assume I've been brought up for charges. So incidentally, in Missoula, I have my friend from Guinea who drives taxi, who drives Uber, and he's taken to recording every interactions on his phone with police to protect himself. And also, incidentally, my brother, one time he was traveling through a Texas airport. Some cops just came out of nowhere and started arresting him, beating him up, roughing him up, saying he was a suspect. And then when they discovered they had the wrong guy, he didn't get an apology, and he had bruises to show for it. My brother can count himself lucky. He was able to go home to his wife and kids. Others were not so lucky. February 1999, Amadou Diallo was hanging out in the stoop of his apartment when 4 NYPD in plain clothes showed up, and through contagious shooting, they fired 41 shots, striking him 19 times. Amadou was unarmed. Later, they claimed they had mistaken Amadou for a rape suspect from a year earlier. Then there was Michael Brown, Brown and his friend were jaywalking in the street. The officer stopped his SUV in front of them to confront them. Brown and the officer had words, and after those words, the officer fired two shots. Brown and his friend took off running. When he turned his face to face the cop, the officer fired 12 shots. 6 hit and killed Brown. Then there was Sandra Bland, who had taken a new job. On her way to a new job, she's failed to use a turn signal. The trooper ordered her out of her vehicle. When she asked why she was being apprehended, the trooper pointed his finger in her face, drew the taser and yelled, "Get out of the car now. I will light you up. Get out now." Sandra was not a suspect in an armed robbery. The car she was driving was not stolen. She had no warrants for her arrest. She simply failed to use her turn signal, and she was Black. She was arrested for assaulting a police officer, and she couldn't afford the $5,000 bail. And a few days later, she was found dead in a cell. Philando Castile shot and killed because on account of his wide-set nose, the officers thought he was a suspect. Elijah McClain had not committed any crime. The officers had no reason to believe he had. They pinned him down, handcuffed him with their full weight over him for 15 minutes, despite him saying, "I can't breathe." Then he vomited. When the paramedics arrived, they injected him with an overdose of ketamine. Elijah died. He was a generous young man who used his lunch breaks to play violin for animals in an animal shelter. Then this agency heard the cries of George Floyd, which is why the agency decided to do an diversity and inclusion survey. You heard the cries for passing a counterfeit a counterfeit $20 bill. The officer killed him. You heard his cries, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe, I can't breathe, mama. I love you. Tell the kids I love them, I'm dead." So back to this hypothetical. Incidentally, this hypothetical is not that different to the case Lassiter that Haley Jackson took all the way to the Supreme Court. Someone called Billings police to say there was a Black man who was really, really spooky looking, going up and down the block, like they were casing out vehicles and houses. The caller was referring to Lassiter, who was stranded because his vehicle, he couldn't drive in the snow, so he got his vehicle stuck in a snowbank. And then when his friend came to help, the caller was still on the phone with dispatch and said, "Both men look like wannabe gangbangers." So you are my lawyer. I was picked up by the victim on the lineup. He said, "Definitely him. I've been brought up on charges. Will you orient the jury on race like they do in the state of Washington? Do you have any voir dire questions prepared? Do you know if I'm closely supervised by probation? Have you prepared any jury instructions on implicit bias? When was the last time you brushed up on Batson? Look me in the eye and tell me, I don't see race. I just put my blinders on and get on with the case. Tell me about, what is that you said about not playing the race card? And I suspect, to borrow the language of Chris Stapleton, I will get 4 cold walls without parole, even if I'm innocent. What is your theory of injustice? Okay, so here is where you get to participate. So go pull out your computers or your phones, and then I want to take the temperature. How are you feeling? Give you a minute.
Can everyone see it okay?
Yeah, so once you start typing your responses, they'll start coming up. So any more responses?
And I think people are working on it now.
Oh, I see. They're starting to come up. Okay, let's digest that, and then let's move on. Okay, so some ground rules. So listen to yourself, listen to your neighbor, listen to me as we go through this process. And then when is your time to participate, translate what you mean. Give your accurate location, tell the truth, voir dire, like you do with your jurors. Demonstrate a respect for your own experience, respect the experience of other people. Listen for meaning, not words. Suspend judgment, and then let's make this a bold and safe space. Okay, so next, participation. Why don't you talk about race in your cases? And so once you tally that, once you start, once you enter, it will come up, and people will see what you've chosen. It seems a lot of us believe that talking about race is going to hurt more than help our clients. Quite a big proportion of you believe that to be the case. And then some of you say, I don't think it's necessary to raise race in every situation. When is it necessary to raise race? That begs that question. And then some people say, I have no credibility to raise race or talk about my client's experience of racial bias. Okay, one sec. A few more minutes there. Okay, so moving on. okay, what's your definition of racism? When you talk about racism, what do you mean? So, because I think a lot of us are not talking about the same thing. What do you mean? So I'll give you a few minutes to do this. While we do this, we'll watch a little video, give you time to collect your thoughts and put it in.
This is the 4th of July. It is the birthday of your national independence and of your political freedom.
Fellow citizens, I shall not presume to dwell at length on the associations that cluster about this day. The simple story of it is that 76 years ago, the people of this country were British subjects.
Oppression makes a wise man mad. Your fathers were wise men, and if they did not go mad, they became restive under this treatment.
With brave men, there's always a remedy for oppression.
They succeeded, and today you reap the fruits of their success. The freedom gained is yours, and you, therefore, may properly celebrate this anniversary.
Fellow citizens, pardon me. Allow me to ask, why am I called upon to speak here today? What have I, or those I represent, to do with your national independence?
Are the great principles of political freedom and of natural justice embodied in that Declaration of Independence extended to us?
I am not included within the pale of this glorious anniversary.
Your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance between us. The blessings in which you this day rejoice are not enjoyed in common.
The rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence bequeathed by your fathers is shared by you, not by me.
The sunlight that brought life and healing to you has brought stripes and death to me.
This 4th of July is yours, not mine.
You may rejoice, I must mourn.
Fellow citizens, above your national tumultuous joy, I hear the mournful wail of millions.
At a time like this, scorching irony, not convincing argument is needed.
Oh, had I the ability and could reach the nation's ear, I would today pour out a fiery stream of biting ridicule, blasting reproach, withering sarcasm, and stern rebuke.
For it is not light that is needed, but fire.
It is not the gentle shower, but thunder.
We need the storm, the whirlwind, and the earthquake.
The feeling of the nation must be quickened.
The conscience of the nation must be roused.
The propriety of the nation must be startled.
The hypocrisy of the nation must be exposed.
And its crimes against God and man must be proclaimed and denounced.
What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him, more than all other days in the year, the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim.
To him, your celebration is a sham.
Your boasted liberty an unholy license.
Your national greatness, swelling vanity.
Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless.
Your denunciations of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence.
Your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery.
Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings,
with all your religious parade and solemnity, are to him
mere bombast,
fraud,
deception,
impiety,
and hypocrisy. There is not a nation on the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of these United States at this very hour. Allow me to say in conclusion, notwithstanding the dark picture I have this day presented of the state of the nation, I do not despair of this country.
Okay, so here are some definitions. Okay, we'll save those for this afternoon when we, and then we'll save those for this afternoon to discuss a little bit more. But for now, let's move on. So let's talk about race. Why talk about race? Systemic, in some of you people's views, and definitely in the view of the Supreme Court, seems like systemic or racial oppression is something that's happening in the state of Washington or in the South, but not in Montana. So you will see, I'll draw for you a contrast. In the state of Washington, they are acknowledging it in their decisions, in what they say, in their bar news. So is it racial oppression or racism, something that happens in Washington and not in Montana? Is that your position? Is that our position? Do you think the Supreme Court of Montana will ever acknowledge pervasive systemic racism in our court systems? What is your role in making that change happen? So we'll talk about the survey that we did as an agency. Some of the comments there were enlightening, I'll say. So the survey said, I've had some problematic conversations about people of color. For instance, some of my co-workers believe the BLM movements are whiny and racist themselves, or rather than structural racism as a cause of protest, is simply laziness. We said that. No one is overtly exclusionary. I think the issue is lack of education. I think anyone with identities that are marginalized would find this a good place to work, but would also hear problematic statements. Question: if you're hearing problematic statements, how do you feel as a marginalized person? Is that exclusionary? What do they mean, exclusionary? Begs the question, if it's not overtly exclusionary, is it unconsciously exclusionary? Do we know? Do we care? How do we know marginalized people find this OPD a good place to work? On what metric do we use? I don't think our agency is racist and supports racism, except, of course, for some of our clients who are entirely racist and we are enlisted to defend them. How do we know the agency is not racist? Why do we believe the clients are racists while the institution is not? What do we mean? Do we know whether the agency's interviewing and selection practices are exclusionary? How do the marginalized people feel when they interact with the interviewers and HR? Do we know? Do we care? Short of wondering, okay, I wonder what it's like to be the only in this agency, the only Black man, the only Native American woman, the only whatever. Short of wondering, have you bothered to ask the only Black man, the only Native American woman? In our collective imagination, can we construct what it is like to be the only? Are the only people alienated and alone within our agency? Do we know and do we care? Somebody said, this agency said, inclusion policies are by definition discriminatory against individuals who have all the necessary qualifications for a job but not have specific racial or sexual characteristics to meet quotas. To me, this begs the question, is the only way to ensure inclusion instituting quotas? instituting a quota system where we just pick any black or brown body without any qualifications. Are we assuming that minorities are not qualified to hold their jobs? Is this the underlying assumption within us?
Moses, can you hear us?
Yes. OPD employees recently used state emails to promote ideas such as white guilt, privilege, and white silence is violence. This is blatantly racist and unacceptable, yet nothing was done about it. In fact, the agency director participated in it. Which racism are we concerned with here as an agency? What are we talking about? Are we talking about the same things? So let's talk about race. For me, I think, in my view, change is happening. Change is slow, but it's happening. Like I said, it seems to me that the Montana justice system, the justices of the Supreme Court are in denial about racial oppression. And they may believe that we are in a post-racial, colorblind justice. Even when we make arguments about race, it's glossed over, and the suggestion is that the person arguing is exaggerating. They won't acknowledge pervasive racism, but luckily there are people, they can be influenced. And what are we going to do about changing their mentality? I think our justices are under the mistaken impression that we are administering colorblind justice in Montana. When are they going to acknowledge systemic oppression? If the only Black person is the person who's always talking about race in their cases, always arguing about race, and then the public defenders, the line attorneys hide their heads in the sand and don't talk about race. So when it comes to appeal, we are trying to do plain error review of these cases. Is change going to happen that way? I doubt it. But when our entire agency, through cross-racial human solidarity, all lend their voice talking about the same systemic oppression in the in unison, and something begins to happen. You saw Catherine Hutchinson lent her voice through brilliance, militancy, facts, and persuasiveness. She put race in context. In the case of Peoples, Peoples became a published opinion. So in the second hour, after we get the shared definition of racism, we will unpack the case of Peoples to see what was argued. Debbie Smith lent her voice, tackled race head-on in a couple of her cases. Her efforts paid off. She got FAM's conviction overturned. Haley Jackson, who's also married to a Black attorney, lent her voice, tackled Lassiter in her own way. So we all have to bring our collective conscience together. We have to cultivate our collective conscience and start speaking the truth to power. So whenever in 2019 we were talking about race, there were non-side opinions, things were getting glossed over, swept under the rug. And you see, even the 1 year later, there's a difference. There's some published opinions. Then there's Peoples, Catherine didn't win the case, but drew a dissent. So we'll discuss that later this afternoon. So I say this because change is possible. So incidentally, in Batson v. Kentucky, there was a dissenter, Justice Thurgood Marshall, the only Black justice, was skeptical of the majority's opinion, the framework they had created. He was skeptical whether it would actually inhibit the use of discrimination in preemptory strikes. Thurgood Marshall warned that the prosecutors could easily assert a facially neutral reason to strike a juror. And you can compare that analysis with the case I took to the Supreme Court, State v. Warren, 2019 MT 49, where the court was satisfied with any race-neutral explanation that the prosecutor did. The prosecutor said, I didn't get to question a prospective juror who happened to be Latino, and then ended up kicking him out of the jury on that basis. And Justice Thurgood Marshall's perspective as the only Black justice in the Supreme Court wasn't taken into account. And so in Washington, in 2013, the Washington Supreme Court acknowledged that because of unconscious racism, Batson wasn't effective, was a toothless and inadequate tool to ferret out discrimination in jury selection. So in April 2019, Washington promulgated its own General Rule 37. And you can take a good read of it, the General Rule 37. The point was to try and also weed out unconscious racism. Incidentally, the Supreme Court of Washington over the years has had more than 42 challenges raising Batson, and they haven't overturned in most of those cases. So the state of Washington, there was in 1990, there was a criminologist that triggered alarm and published a finding that Washington had the highest disproportionate imprisonment of Black residents in any states in the United States. And so after decades of discussion, both inside and outside the courtroom, about the pervasive role of racism and bias in the Washington legal system, its Supreme Court promulgated General Rule 37. So change is possible. The Washington Supreme Court is an example of somewhere where the Supreme Court itself is acknowledging and doing something about racism. Can we get our court to be there as well? So in June 4th, 2020, the Supreme Court of Washington wrote this following letter to the members of this judiciary. Dear members of the judiciary and the legal community, we are compelled by recent events to join other state Supreme Courts around the nation in addressing our legal community. The devaluation and degradation of Black lives is not a recent event. It is a persistent and systemic injustice that predates the nation's founding. But recent events have brought to the forefront of our collective conscience a painful fact that is for far too many of our citizens common knowledge. The injustices faced by Black Americans are not relics of the past. And then it goes on, as judges, we must recognize the role that we have played in devaluing Black lives. This very court once held that a cemetery could lawfully deny grieving Black parents the right to bury their infant. We cannot undo this wrong, but we can recognize our ability to do better in the future. We can develop our greater awareness of our conscious and unconscious biases in order to make just decisions in individual cases, and we can administer justice and support court rules in a way that brings greater racial justice in our system as a whole. And then finally, as individuals, we must recognize that systemic racial injustice against Black Americans is not an omnipresent specter that will inevitably persist. It is the collective product of each of our individual actions, every action, every day. It is only by carefully reflecting on our actions, taking individual responsibility for them, and constantly striving for better that we can address the shameful legacy we inherit. We call on every member of our legal community to reflect on this moment and ask ourselves how we may work together to eradicate racism. As we lean in to do this hard work and necessary work, we may also remember to support our Black colleagues by lifting their voices. Listening to and acknowledging their experiences will enrich and inform our shared cause of dismantling systemic racism. This is our moral imperative in the signed 9 justices of the Washington Supreme Court. We can discuss more how change is possible in subsequent talks, but change is possible. We must get in trouble, good trouble, use the law, use the Constitution to bring about non-violent revolution. That's what John Lewis, before his death, said. So let's go to the definition. The definition of racism, I'll give you this definition. Systemic oppression of a racial group to the social, economic, and political advantage of another. Racism is about misuse of power that's added to prejudice. So like the Washington Supreme Court said, there's the individual action, and then when it comes mixed with power, it becomes part of the institutional and structural aspects. So this afternoon, we're going to use the lens of systemic oppression to look at the decisions and certain legal constructions. Consider this definition coming from Soul Focused Group. Racism is a system of white affirmative action subsidized by the oppression of people of color and of poor white people to undermine and disrupt natural human solidarity. Why do they say that? Incidentally, so the capitalists tried to create a white caste system so they can exploit both the poor white people and all the other people of color. And they were using whiteness as a tool of division. Incidentally, in Brazil, you could move from one racial category to another if you had money. And they say money whitens. Going back to that Dred Scott decision, it lays out the racist construction. It talks about a subordinate and inferior class of beings who are subjugated by the dominant race and who remain subject to the authority of the dominant race. Like we said, the story of America is about the power struggle against dehumanization, against thingification of Black and brown bodies, fighting not to be subjugated in your own country. At every turn, 13th Amendment gets written, the South through power and abuse of power created different measures, the black codes, slave codes, and other things to defeat, to continue the subjugation of people of color. So,
there is no such thing as race. None.
Really?
There's just a human race. Scientifically, anthropologically, racism is a construct, a social construct, and it has benefits. It has money can be made off of it. In people who don't like themselves can feel better because of it. It can describe certain kinds of behavior that are wrong or misleading. So it has a social function, racism. But race can only be defined as a human being.
If the racist white person, I don't mean the person who is examining his consciousness and so on, doesn't understand that he or she is also a race, it's also constructed, it's also made, and it also has some kind of serviceability. But when you take it away, I take your race away, and there you are, all strung out, and all you got is your little self. And what is that? What are you without racism? Are you any good? Are you still strong? You still smart? You still like yourself? If you can only be tall because somebody's on their knees, then you have a serious problem. And my feeling is white people have a very, very serious problem. And they should start thinking about what they can do about it. Take me out of it.
You don't think you will ever change and write books that incorporate white lives into them substantially?
I have done.
In a substantial way?
You can't understand how powerfully racist that question is, can you? Because you could never ask a white author, when are you going to write about black people? Whether he did or not, or she did or not. Even the inquiry comes from a position of being in the center.
And being used to being in the center.
And being used to being in the center.
Here's a question for you. You can participate. I'll give you 2 minutes.
Moses, quick question. Is this is your last slide, right?
Yeah, so there's one more slide and then that's it.
Okay.
Okay, so I'll move on to the next slide. No, let's just skip that and then I'll go to okay, so let's just finish with this. Let's deal with this question and then that will be the end of the presentation, the first hour anyway. listening to your client's story, listening to our client's perspectives, talk about it, get on the record, use experts if possible, educate ourselves, a good one, about our client's experience, pay attention to race in the story, a good one. Listen to the client, that's a major one. Include all the facts relevant to race, like Catherine did, like Haley did, like Debbie did. Voice the fact of it, voice how perceptions are different and show why. Ask the client if they'd like to talk about it, give them time to answer. Okay, here is the last slide, I promise. So this is some of the things that you can take away from the first hour. We can talk more about it in the second hour. But, share the power with your client. See through the lens of systemic oppression. Make race salient in your case. Stand in the gap. Don't gaslight them. Don't seem like you're in a conspiracy with the state against them. Through your own voice, find the courage to tell the truth. Tell the truth that you don't see it. Tell the truth about systemic oppression. Brainstorm with your colleagues. Build a record. Introduce the jury questionnaire. How about? There are voir dire questions out there, sample ones. But how come we don't have an outline? We have an outline for everything in the OPD, except when we talk about discrimination and implicit bias. Where is our outline? Like brilliant minds in OPD, where is the outline on implicit bias? Orienting the jury, instruct the juries. In Washington, they orient the jury. The first video you see is judges, Supreme Court judges and district court judges are the ones leading the charge, talking about implicit bias. The first thing you see is a judge talking about implicit bias. And then there's instruction videos that I've compiled also in Change is Possible section. You can see judges setting the tone, talking about implicit bias, preparing the jury to make a decision that's not based on implicit bias. Do you know if your clients are getting disparate treatment while they're sentencing? And also there's a bunch of books, read, learn. I have a bunch of books that you can read and learn. So I guess, are we going to the next? Are we taking a break or what's going on next?
Yes, until 4.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, so
Okay.
I don't think anything is scheduled for after 4. So what I think we can do is, I personally want a minute or 2 break, and then we can start again. And then either we can go for an hour, or as long as people are willing to stick around, because I think we're here, we have this room till the end of the day.
Okay, so 4:30 you want?
4:30 sounds like a good estimate, yeah.
Okay. Is that all right with you, Moses? 4:30 to...
So what is the plan? So we'll take a break till 4:30?
Yes.
Not till 4:30. But we can
Start
take a
up at
break,
4:30.
start again, and then we can go from like 3:30 to 4:30.
Well, it's already 3:30.
Okay, so let's say this. Maybe take a 10-minute.
And 3:30.
So do you want to come? Let's come back at 3:30 if you guys want to come back. This is more discussion for the next part. And then break by 4:30 or end by 4:30. Yes, right, Nick?
Yeah.
Okay.
So we take brief break, start again at 3:30, wrap up around 4:30.
Okay, I like that plan.
Okay.
So I'll be in about 6 minutes. We'll be on.
You mean what?
Okay, I'll take a quick break.
Okay. Do you want to just leave your Zoom on?
Yes, I'll do that.
Okay.
Anyone confused by that stream of consciousness planning? We're starting again at 3:30.